Okay, everybody. It is now time to get started for our session. And um, this is the session with, um, what's it called? Integrated scenarios, embedded relevance throughout your course. And so we have Jennifer Myka. She has taught over 30 different biology courses and similar number of lab courses at the college level. Uh, I'm sorry. And she has earned a BA from Hiram College in Hiram, Ohio, and has followed that with a Master's of Science and PhD from the University of Kentucky. She has long been a prominent and active teaching and learning. She has many presentations and publications in the field of science education and has been involved in science education and outreach at the local, regional, and national levels. Most recently, while at Gateway Community and Technical College, she integrated genomics into the freshman biology majors course using her experiences as a member of the National Genomics Education Partnership. She has also introduced freshman biology majors to the field of environmental engineering in collaboration with the RTE program at the University of Cincinnati. So I would like to welcome Jennifer and everyone to this session. Just remember, if you want to have questions, post those in the chat and I will be moderating those. So I will hand it over to Jennifer.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. So here we go. So what I wanted to talk about today with you guys is about integrated scenarios. And it's a way that I've been using for a while in different formats to embed relevance throughout courses. And the idea of that is that if we can get the students to see why something is relevant, then that content is easier for them to integrate, use, understand, and learn. And so that's the point of it, is to take what we're doing, find new ways to get that to be more relevant when the students might not always see it. So there we go. So the way that I set up the presentation, just for reference, I went ahead and put the abstract from the talk here, just for reference, if you would like to see it at some point. But the big piece, we want to always increase student engagement. And this is a way to do it. If you use an integrated scenario, it's sort of like giving a story, and everybody relates to stories. So they relate to it, and then when they follow along with that and the required content shows up, it works better that way. And you can use it with new materials, which I've done, or you can actually go with what you already have in place and just add this. And one last piece is that you can use it to add diversity and inclusion opportunities in addition to what you are already doing. So here we go. So the first piece, I'm going to go ahead and talk about why integrated scenarios a little bit more. Okay. Where I'm coming from, I teach biology. This will work in other fields too, but my examples are going to be biology. And basically, especially the non-majors are not really excited about our courses. They don't see the relevance. They see it as a check off. We're going to have to check this off. We're going to have to take this class. It's required to graduate. Don't know why I have to take it, right? And that happens with a lot of the courses, especially our gen eds, where students just don't see what we see as to why it's helpful. So that piece is to add that relevance by adding integrated scenarios so that they have that story. And going along with it, just to show where this came from, at this point, I've taught almost 760 semester credit hours so far. So I've got a lot of experience with it and without it, and feel like I can show where that's going to be helpful. Okay. What I'm going to start with is actually a bigger example, in that it's a comparison between just the regular way people go about teaching most courses, especially the level that we are at the community college system, and looking at the gen eds. There's usually an original format, and then I have a newer one, and that's our bigger example. But I've also will follow up with an integrated story that's a smaller example, so you can see You could go big or small with this, depending on what fits what you're doing. Okay. All right. So to start, the idea of this was that when I was first looking into these kind of things, and I'm going to put my pointer in, what I looked at is that there are, most of the time what we do, we choose a textbook most of the time, and we pick which chapters we're doing. Most of the time they go in order from 1 to whatever number from the author. Sometimes you mix it up a little bit. And that's generally the way that we do it. We have that chapter, we have that content, it fits what we're doing, works really well. And big advantages are that students are really used to this. They have been getting this format forever because they're used to textbooks. And the other piece of it is that all the content you want to look at can be in a chapter, like whatever that big topic is for the chapter. They typically have all the pieces that you might need available right there, one chapter with all the resources and everything that you're provided with. So it kind of goes together. The disadvantage is that sometimes what'll happen is that the students go through the order that we're all used to and has kind of historically worked fairly well. And you find out later that you got done with a unit, and later on, something that you thought they knew because we went through it, and maybe they did okay on everything. Later on, they realize that there's more to it, and it suddenly the light bulbs come off or go off, and it's later in the semester. Sometimes in the worst case scenario, they didn't do so well on the exam over the material to begin with, and then later they show you that actually they did get it, but their grade's not reflecting it. They didn't get it at the time you presented it, they got it later when you had other information. So this idea was from that experience that I had, and my example is going to be from a medical microbiology course, and that's a non-majors course in a way because the nursing students typically take it, but you'll be able to see from whatever your area is how I pulled this together. So instead of just going with each chapter the normal way that everyone's used to, I picked out parts of the chapters that I needed to fit it within a story, within a scenario. So why is that helpful? Well, one piece of it is that then we're able to present the material in a context where students see why it's relevant. So it's not the context of just it's in the chapter you have to read and learn. It's in the context of you're putting it in a place where they can picture themselves in the scenario to some extent. The disadvantage may be, and this will depend on your field and what your textbook options are and things like that. A lot of times this means the material may not be in that one chapter. It might be, you might have to jump around a little for certain topics. I'm not going to say you always have to do this, but the example I'm going to show, and I'll explain it, I had to jump to a different chapter or I didn't get the understanding that I was hoping for. And so the scenario thing helped out a lot. Okay, so here we go. All right, so, and I'm going to kind of read this down. It's 2 slides, and I'm going to walk you through how this worked. This is the setup of the scenario. Okay, so this scenario 5 that I had, basically what I would have in my class, that each piece of this would show up on a slide. So it would be like the organizing slide for the student. And then in between each of these parts would be what you would typically look at. So for example, this first part, what it started out with, because it's later in the semester, said, you know that normal E. coli has the potential to become a pathogen. And then the questions that you would do in this case was, once E. coli has this information, how does it lead to a new infectious strain? How does it get passed along? And so in this perspective, we were looking at the DNA chapter, and the topic was DNA replication. Part 2, we go, well, you understand that DNA can change and cause problems, but you also know that DNA is just the blueprint. So the question is, how does the information in the DNA get used in cells? So that was also in that same chapter on gene expression. How does that work? Okay. Part 3, if DNA is a blueprint and the blueprint gets used to help the cell carry out its normal day-to-day activities, how do we get normal E. coli to become pathogenic? And so how does this change in the DNA lead to that phenotype? I had to jump to the next chapter. In some books, it might have been in the same chapter, but I had to go to mutations to show this. Okay. And then we find if you get a mutation, it could be fixed. So that's still in that chapter 8. So that was the second chapter I had to go to, like I said. And now here's why I did this really is part 5. What happened is that when we got to antimicrobial drugs in this particular class, so it's non-majors in one way and in, for the nursing majors in another way, that's something extremely relevant to pretty much everybody. And that particular population of students wants to work to help in the clinical setting. So what's going to end up happening is that suddenly we got up to chapter 21. And if you go in the normal progression, that would have been at the very end of the semester. And the way that ended up coming about then was that those students would be looking at this, realize that they had patients with infections and that we would treat them with antimicrobials. And there was that part, but they didn't get, how did we get from, why in the world did I look at DNA ever, to how come that might be relevant when we get changes? And the big example in this case would have been MRSA, actually, where you get antibiotic resistant bugs. And they knew about that. They knew about it when we learned about DNA, but it did not click at all when I used to teach it. Here's the DNA section. Now here's the antibiotic section. They didn't see the crisscross at all. And the relevance to them was the later material. And you do build up for a reason. We know that. You have to build up to where you can understand all of it. But what I was able to do by adding the scenario in was to give them kind of a way to lead through. Yeah, we've got the DNA thing. We've got an example of an infection. Maybe not a big deal. Once we hit this piece, we didn't do the whole chapter necessarily there. But when I introduced that section and we looked at it and I said, this is the difference. This is what you're looking at. You had bacteria that had DNA and some of them that mutated now are antimicrobial, like they're resistant to the drugs, right? Now that's why you had to do that chapter way back. And that is what added the relevance. So it's not specifically about that this was the story. It was more about that the relevant part of why they were doing this big section of the course didn't show up until later. And without making it more formalized, like a piece of what we were doing and part of the content, it didn't click. And what I also saw, and had done some work on this in the past, found that they actually, the exam that had the DNA part, they didn't do as well before because they couldn't see why they cared. That was the big issue. They had no idea why they were going to care about it. So they just did as much as they could figure out and would move on. And then later it would come back and then I would hear where they were coming from. And so that was a piece of what would happen. So when we got back to that last piece, it was, that normal Staph aureus is not MRSA, just like normal E. coli in your gut is not the one that makes you sick. So how did that work? It kind of pulled it all together and they finally were looking at it in such a way that they could see where this was going to come together. Okay. So the anecdotal observations that I'd like to share and kind of to summarize this piece, those particular students had a hard time with the DNA topics. And what would happen is that they wouldn't, like I said, they didn't do as well as I had hoped. I had tried all the traditional things up until that time of just trying different ways to present it, working on different options, just the normal things you do when students don't succeed as well as you wish they did. And it wasn't getting much success. But then at a certain point, I noticed that they would make a comment later in the semester after I had a test that I felt like they could have done better and I couldn't figure out why they weren't. They would say, well, is this antibiotic resistance why we learned about that bacterial conjugation, which is a DNA technique, for the last test? And I would say, yeah. And then what was very interesting is the discussions with my students in the classroom when that was coming up. I realized that at that moment, they knew the stuff that I had taught them before, but they didn't show that to me on that exam because when they had it and when they were going over it, they didn't see any place to put it. They did not know why that was relevant, really. And so that was what the problem was. So what I ended up needing to do, and then it did change the success of what I saw. And also I did some action research. So it wasn't just the overall test grade by adding in a topic that they liked better, even checked some of the content using some of the same questions before and after. And it did improve their success. And it was the relevant piece. So when they see something as relevant, we know that's when students get engaged. And when students get engaged, that's when the material actually sticks and they're able to see what's going on and work with it. Okay. So what I wanted to say that was a bigger example was for that particular course, what I needed to do was actually make some big changes from the original format to the format of integrating those scenarios. And I kind of had to jump around a little bit in the book. I didn't completely shred the book or anything like that, but I did look ahead and find where topics get split up because it's the typical way that we look at it, and looked for where there was content that if it was side by side, the students would understand it better and see the point better. And those were the parts that I changed. Tried not to change too much because at the exact same time, like I said, the disadvantage of doing it is if we jump around too much, the students may not see why they're needing to do that and they could get a little lost. Obviously, I also had to include a bunch of materials, make sure they knew exactly where we were in their book so that it was straightforward. Okay, so that's where we were on that piece. Okay, all right. To another example then that is a little bit of a shorter example is integrating a story in what you already have. Okay, so not as big of a change. And basically, when you do this, I'll show you a way that you can do it. But the idea of it is that you might not even have to change anything that you are preparing ahead for the students necessarily. You might just even change the presentation of it. So I'll show you what I mean. Okay. So the integrated story, okay. The original piece is the same. We've got individual chapters. Students are used to it. We have that content together, okay? The disadvantage might be that they don't see why, okay? If you integrate a story in the current content, it's still in the same content. So I didn't have to move around in my syllabus. I didn't have to move around in the book. I could take the same thing that they already are going to be looking at anyhow, and then I use that by adding the story in a more formalized way. So it's very obvious to them what the story is, and then they can start to see themselves in it. A disadvantage, I actually couldn't really think of any great ones because I feel like there's a lot of advantages. You might have a little trouble finding a storyline, and that's why I'm actually going to share the one I'm sharing today, is that it's actually fictional. I just kind of made it up and found a way to use it in a couple different ways. Okay, so here's what I had. Okay, so non-majors biology, this was the intro. And what I'm going to say is that it starts out at the very beginning in most non-majors books. At some point early on, usually somewhere in chapter 1, it mentions there's all these different kinds of things out in the world, including bacteria. Okay, and for students who are not remotely going to be in a biological or clinical area, they don't always know why we're bothering. Okay, so here's this scenario I have. So I've got, you're taking a wilderness vacation in the jungle. One of the guides doesn't show up for breakfast one morning, and you hear that he has a fever and a swollen area around a cut on his foot. You decide to check on the guide to see if you can be of assistance. He clearly has not slept well, and he looks sweaty and tired. His foot is quite swollen, and the skin is red and hot around a small cut. When you speak with the guide, he said that he's being punished for saying unkind words to another guide, and you're surprised because you thought everybody knew about germs. So the question is, what are germs? Didn't everybody already know about germs, and how did we find out, basically? Why this was a good one, two things. One is that actually I've experienced in my own teaching where I thought that that was an obvious concept that people outside of school knew about infections. They understood how that worked. And they found that actually sometimes they didn't have any clue. They just did not know. And then the other piece to it is that when you're looking at it, and I've heard this too, I've had students tell me that sometimes they're understanding some of the content, but they talk about friends and family members who don't look at it like that at all. And so a piece of this, I put this story in the jungle just so I had a good reason to come up with an infected foot, but it doesn't have to be even that far out, because there are people right now that you could go in a setting where there's somebody had an issue like that, and they may not know that it could have been an infection and it could have been a bacteria, and then to know what to do about that. So when I say germs in quotes, it's because not everybody completely realizes this. The other place that it helps a little bit, and for some other areas this might be useful idea, is that some of the textbooks talk about how we figured it out. How did people originally find out about microbes? So it goes back to the first microscope and things like that. And the history before that of what people did when they didn't know germ theory, they came up with lots of explanations that weren't accurate. So it kind of works in a lot of ways. So this little scenario, just small, just saying this is something that maybe isn't as straightforward. If they just read the book, the book just starts to say this is these are organisms, this is how we found out, and it's real dry. Doing this, they're starting to think about it from being in the story. And so it kind of worked that way, and it did do a better job with getting the discussion and the things that I was hoping for, and getting them a little more interested in studying those initial topics that they didn't think they cared about. Okay. So anecdotal evidence or observations, and this is an example from one of the labs that goes along with the same time frame in that particular class. If they take that lab, there's human cheek cells, and then in the debris is probably bacteria. Okay. And previously students really didn't see why they cared about the different kinds of cells. They just didn't completely get why that might be important. But if you can show them a story where it's relevant to them, they can see it's relevant to their lives. And the levels of relevance may be different. So that's another piece of this, is that on the one hand, I might be looking at it from my science content. I want somebody to know there's different kinds of cells and a little of the history of how we found out, learn about the microscope, that kind of a piece. But there's more to it, because there's also some cultural pieces to it, in that not everybody has the same experience. Not everybody's looked at it the same way. And sometimes it could be culture where it's not something that's outside of just the typical United States experience, as if there's one, but it could also be really, right now, it does depend on the backgrounds of people and what they're seeing around them. So what I notice when I use something like this is that some of the students will look at it from that perspective of, oh, now I know how to treat a problem. And they look at it from that more science side of it, where that might work. But I also find that then I see students who are able to talk with friends and family in a different way and engage differently. And that wasn't what my original intention was when I first was trying to teach that information, but it fits perfectly. And so that gives us another piece to, like, another piece in the tool chest. Okay. All right. So how could you use this? Again, we have two different examples. So yeah. Okay. First of all, what I'd suggest if you do this, one way to start really easily would be to just find a topic where the students are not very engaged, something that you know they always have to learn. You're finding it a little bit frustrating because they don't seem to care. We know when they don't care, they can nod and smile, but we know. Find something like that where you're just kind of like, I don't understand why they're not finding this exciting, and kind of go from there. And this uploaded a little funny. But when you do that, this is a piece, and this is why I wanted to bring this up. Think about a storyline where the students can picture themselves in it somehow, okay? And when I'm talking about that, and I mentioned the kinesthetic learning, the reason why I'm adding that in for you guys is that one of the things that's become really known, and you may have heard it in other active learning type of places, but you might not have. When we first were looking at different options of how do I improve, teaching and learning, and you looked at learning styles, and we know there's, audio and verbal and visual, and then there's this kinesthetic one, and it was always called the hands-on one. Okay. And one of the things that has been very interesting is that within education, we've gotten a better feel for this, but actually a way to relate to the students even is outside of education. And one place that this gets used amazingly well is in athletics, like professional sports, because what they're able to do is they've done a lot of work in the sports area of getting people to visualize doing something that might be physical, like throwing a ball. Okay, and I get this sounds like out of the way, but what they find is that when they ask them to visualize doing it to where they're picturing it in between, a couple of things are happening. One is you can actually get better physically, even though you're not using the muscles, by picturing it working. And the other part that, as a science person, fascinated me, it turns out that when they measure the brain waves look identical whether you're actually throwing the ball or picturing yourself throwing the ball. Okay, that's of interest, because what we need to be able to do then is just find a way for the student to picture themselves in any portion of what we're doing, and that will actually increase the learning because it becomes kinesthetic as soon as they could picture it in any way that they do. It adds so much beyond what is typical. So when you have something that's not hands-on necessarily, like I teach that topic, if the student isn't taking the lab and doing something to look at their cells, that's completely not hands-on for them. But if I can have them picture themselves in the scenario, now it becomes kinesthetic and the learning is similar. You take whatever story you come up with and use it to show the relevance. And then the last one, I highlighted it in yellow on purpose, because what I wanted you to remember is that regardless of how we're doing all of this, really best practices is to organize everything around essential questions, which are the ones that if students could answer those questions, we know they've gotten what we wanted them to. So a way to check if what you're doing on this is going to fit your learning outcomes is you find that topic where they're not engaged, you think about how you might do this, and make sure that if you use that you can help them see where it fits in to answer those essential questions, which are the ones we say we need to do on the syllabus, right? So it kind of finishes the loop. And if you do it that way, you know that you're going to be on the right track and that whatever way you pick, it's going to be helpful. And it, like I said, also gives us that extra piece of kinesthetic learning where that's not always that easy to get for everybody. It's harder to picture it if you can't see how it's hands-on, but you can have them visualize being in a scenario in some manner or another. Okay. So there we go. So actually, what we did is we looked at our integrated scenarios, had the idea of what we might do with it, tried to show you a big example if you have something where it would really fit a lot, and then a small example, because I find I can come up with at least one per day in my classes now of a way to think about it, whether I put it in a PowerPoint or just talked about it or gave them a case study or whatever it is I used, find ways to do it. And then integrate that into what I'm trying to go with. And I see the results and see what's going on with that and wanted to share with everyone. So I'd say at this point, I think I'm pretty close to where I needed to be. I just wanted to see if anybody has any questions. I don't know why that, okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have one in the chat.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so okay. So how to divert thinking of the example if you're not looking at germs, like what if this guide got a snake bite? So absolutely. So in that particular, with that idea, it could go so many different ways depending on what your actual needs are for your course. So if I'm teaching the course, I could do it about the germs. I could do it about something else might have happened. Okay. So I think that just being creative actually makes a big difference. It really does help and does work. And I'm not sure if that didn't quite exactly answer. Come back. Okay. And Christina, the scenarios. Okay. So the ones that I did the bigger piece, what I was doing was actually taking each exam like a big unit, sort of, right? So I forget, depending on the class, it's anywhere from 3 to 5 big units where you have your exams. What I was able to do with that then would be I would pick a piece of this scenario, and then after including that piece of the content and making sure they knew where I was looking and everything, we'd go over the information that we would have done before the scenario. Like it was still that same content. And so it would have been, in that case, a lot of times that particular example was several parts over several lessons. So when I did it in person, actually, it worked out great. We'd have each lecture, I'd do a piece of it. And actually, I've done this kind of both ways. So if you were doing it in person, you could just have it as a piece of the lecture, and some of those embedded questions, which you didn't see what else I would have had. I would have had my whole presentation, given them information. I try to embed some questions either in PowerPoint or I stop and ask. And so that worked really well in person. When I've been doing virtual, like hybrid type of classes where sometimes we're on campus, sometimes we're virtual like this, put them in small groups to answer the questions and kind of go. And where I've done some of the things online, yeah, definitely, I would have put that as pieces. I might have named it differently, but it would have been parts of either part of a big module or part of a unit, and kind of working very close on that piece. Mm-hmm. And let me comment. Gwen, thank you for your comment too. Because Gwen says it's very appropriate for use in the nursing education, because from my end, I'm supporting that. And definitely you can add it in on top of the case studies, because you just have to add the right questions in. And so that can work out pretty well, regardless of whatever way this goes. Okay. So you could do it in all versions. And I tend to, when we find something that works, I try to find ways to continue to use it. So I have adapted some of this in different formats, definitely, and works really well. And like I said, you could do any of these things. You could make it formalized and make a whole scenario and set it up that way, or know it for yourself, how to do it. Okay. If you wanted to restructure the class like that, it took a while when I very first did the big restructuring of that particular class. Other classes, I've used the technique without having to restructure it that way. But that particular one, what I ended up doing was I took the table of contents of the book so that I knew what I wanted. So I kind of had a list, which I kind of grabbed from the publisher, right? Looked at that and then said, okay, if I want these pieces together, I rearranged it so that the pieces went together with where I thought it was more appropriate. So for example, the biggest change in that class was actually moving several different parts of material back to when they learned about the molecular parts, the DNA parts, because that was where really we were losing them mostly. They did not see where it went. And so what I did was, when I rearranged everything on my table of contents, I minimized that as much, in a way, because it would be easier for them and easier on me too. And so it did take a bit of time on the planning side of it to decide how to make sure I still hit everything. And then after I figured out the one that was the most challenging, actually the other ones were pretty easy. And that I was able to kind of come up with a background story that I could use for a couple chapters and kind of put them in some kind of a scenario similar to what we looked at. So it did take a while at the very beginning. And I think another way to do it, so it was definitely several hours of pondering on how to rearrange, and then more time just setting up your materials like normal, like you're going to have to do. So I would recommend that start with the biggest challenge piece first, and then a piece of it, that means you could kind of address it pretty quickly by making a change, and then adjust around there, and then determine whether you need to rearrange anything else. And like I said, it's not that the textbooks are wrong. I mean, we've been using these things for a long time, and they're very good at keeping the information together, but sometimes our students aren't going to see why if we don't jump to something that they know the relevance of or can picture that relevance. So I think that that would be the way that I would go about it. So I started a little with the idea and then spent a bunch of time to get that one big shift made, and then just spent more time later like slowly fleshing out scenarios so I had them through the whole course. So I don't think I did them all at once, but I did do the biggest change at one time. So I don't know if that answers your question, Leah. Hopefully. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right, Lori. Lori's asking is that one of the disadvantages might be finding an appropriate scenario, and then I use guided questions to target the specific student learning outcomes. So the question is, first, do I find most of my scenarios are fictional or real life? And do I have a resource or resources that I pull from? And that's not the dry textbook. So actually, yeah, what I found, I've used a mixture. I think that for me, it was a little easier for me to use ones that were more fictional. And where I started getting some of the ideas from was kind of looking at case studies that might be available. And so every field has somewhere where there's case studies. I'm lucky in science. Anybody who's teaching in science, it's now moved to the National Science Teachers Association, but the University of Buffalo, State University of New York in Buffalo, has a case study repository for teaching in the sciences, and they're up to about 700 cases right now. I believe you have to go through NSTA now, kind of moved it from the university into that more national platform. Not expensive to get to use it, and you can see a lot of it ahead. But what was nice about that resource was that I could go in and look for a case that might have been of interest and just have the idea of it. So I don't always need to use the whole case, and some of the cases don't fit my class, but the story does. So that was a place that I looked. I looked for places where we kind of had case studies out there. That gave me a lot of ideas. And then other pieces, honestly, was just sometimes I get an idea by a question a student asks me, and then they might not know it, but down the road that might turn into another element in a scenario. So like the very first one where I saw people weren't seeing why we were looking at bacteria, well, this was the second example in the non-majors class. I was surprised when I found students telling me that they were having trouble with family members wanting to get treated for common infections because they didn't think that's what happened. They didn't understand. And so it was a very interesting piece. And that's when I was also first realized that the diversity and equity and inclusion piece comes in, even though that wasn't why I put it there in the first place. It turned out it was more robust than I thought. So that might be another piece. If you have a comment by a student that you're a little surprised by, sometimes that's a way to go about it. Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you. All right. And are there any other questions from anybody? Excellent. Thanks so much, you guys.
Okay, so we might have time for one more question. If you all have questions, feel free to raise your hand and put your stuff in the chat if you want to.
I'll just add one little tiny piece that could be a fun, well, I guess I'm a science nerd, so I'm going to think this is fun. One thing you can do is if you decide to try a mini scenario somewhere, you might do something like pull out of your last time that you did an assessment, like a quiz or an exam with the questions over that topic that it's related to, and then add it in one time. Just try it out and go back and just see. You can do a really quick, short action research thing by just looking at the success at some of the questions. And sometimes it's not a lot of work. Like you can be big and formal, but you can also do a quick check. And I did that when I did the microbiology course because I really wanted to make sure I was not missing anything by doing it that way. And instead, I did actually find improvements. So you want to cause no harm first, and then an improvement's even better. So that might be a quick, easy way to just see whether or not adding that little bit of relevance gave you a little better success in a particular question or couple questions. So. Thanks, Lorraine. All right. Okay.
Okay. Well, Thank you for everybody for attending, and thank you, Jennifer, for this excellent presentation. I love the
Thank you.
examples that you presented. Just wanted to kind of close out and remind everybody that we will